In the sign test, the primary objective was to test that whether the median difference, whether it is different from 0 or whether there is no difference as far as the median of the two related samples is concerned. So students, usually we set up a hypothesis and we assume that proportion of the positive signs is expected to be the same as that of the negative signs, and we wanted to see that for particular samples whether the proportion of positive signs is that different from that of the proportion of the negative signs. Now when we apply the sign test for certain kind of problems, in some problems we would like to test a two-tailed test of equal not equal type, while for rest of the problems we might be interested in testing the directional hypothesis, which are of greater than type or are of less than type. So students, the parameter for which we would like to test our hypothesis under the sign test, that will be denoted as MD, where MD stands for median of the population of differences between the pairs of measurements. Now first of all, we would be talking about the testing procedure for two-tailed test. So students, as you can see, this is a pair of hypotheses we are going to test under the two-tailed test. So students, यहाँ पे आप देखिए कि MD H under H naught equal to 0 is indicating that there is no difference as far as the median of the two related samples is concerned. Whereas if we are talking about the alternative hypothesis, that is indicating that there is a difference between the two medians of the related sample. Or you can also restate this pair of hypotheses with a slight difference. Here you are going to use the proportions. So we are assuming that proportion of positive signs are the same as the proportion of negative signs, and they are in equal proportion, that is 0.5. Whereas in alternative, you can test the same with the not equal sign. Step number 2, as you know, that we need to determine the level of significance, and that is being denoted as alpha. Whereas as far as the next step is concerned, we would be talking about test statistic. So as far as the test statistic is concerned, for each pair xi, yi, we would have to record the sign of the difference obtained by subtracting yi's from the xi's. So we record the plus signs if the difference is positive, and we record the minus signs if the difference is negative. But if there are ties, that means both of the values are same. So in that case, xi will be considered as the same as yi for any pair. So we eliminate those pairs that are equal. That means where we observe that the difference, there is no difference between xi and yi. So we would reduce the sample size by the number of pair values, the measurements xi's and yi's, where both are identical. So if H naught is true, we expect a sample of difference to include about as many positive signs as the negative signs. So we are assuming that they are in equal proportion. So once we compare the critical value with that of the tabulated value, so critical region here would be, so we would have to reject H naught if probability of K being less than equal to K given that n, where n is the sample size, comma 0.5, where 0.5 is the proportion that has to be less than equal to alpha by 2. So if this particular condition is true, then we will reject our null hypothesis. And lastly, on comparing the calculated value with the tabulated value, we would be rejecting our null hypothesis. Now as far as the testing procedure for the one-tailed is concerned, here students, you can see that the pair of hypotheses could be of type less than equal to 0 against the alternative that it is positive, or MD is greater than equal to 0, where the alternative hypothesis is that it is negative or less than 0. इसी के पैरेलल स्टूडेंट्स ये देखिए हमने pair of hypothesis in form of proportion किए हैं identify. Proportion of positive sign is less than equal to proportion of minus sign, and the alternative hypothesis is that proportion of positive sign is greater than that of the minus. And same is with this pair of hypotheses, that proportion of positive sign is greater than equal to proportion of negative sign, and the alternative is that it is less. Level of significance is the next step, and finally the test statistic is the same as that for the two-tailed test. As far as the one-tailed test is concerned, where the alternative hypothesis is of less than or greater than type, we would have to make two considerations for each one of them. The sufficiently small number of negative signs lead us to reject H0. The test statistic for the hypothesis will be the number of negative signs. And if there are sufficiently small number of positive signs, they will lead us to reject H0. Then the test statistic for this hypothesis will be the number of positive signs. So we would have to reject H0 if probability of k less than equal to k given the sample size, comma 0.5, which is the proportion, it has to be less than alpha. That means if this statement is true, then we would have to reject our null hypothesis. And upon comparison of the previous two steps, we would be concluding whether to reject or accept our null hypothesis.